So I have this NZXT H1. This is the first generation that lights on fire. I don't really mind that because I don't think mine will catch on fire, because I just remove the screws and then I think you can eliminate the problem. And if you are really careful, you can also just isolate that PCB with some electrical tape and not use the screws, and I guess you will be fine. But otherwise, I think this is a cool case, really small form factor case, and it looks cool. And I wanted to do some really small gaming build in this one, nothing special. So I haven't really researched the 5700G processor from AMD, but I think the CPU performance is somewhere near a 5600X, but it's more expensive since we have the integrated APU or integrated graphics. So I was hoping for the 5700G to be somewhere similar in performance to either a 1050 Ti or the much better 1650, much better. So it would be nice if we could just use a 5700G without having to bother hooking up a old type of GPU, and then we could maybe invest in a better GPU down the road. So with the 5700G, I unfortunately don't have any in-game footage because the Radeon software with the screen capture doesn't support 5700G APUs to screen record, and if I were to like download external program screen recorder, I was seeing FPS drops, so I just skipped that. So you will really need like an external capture card to actually get real FPS and not impact the frames, but I don't have that, so we will just skip this in this video here. So I'm using the same settings in all of these tests here in Modern Warfare Multiplayer, 720p all lowest settings, and then later 1080p all lowest settings. I have to say 720p was fully playable with the 5700G, even though of course it doesn't look really good. But turning it up to 1080p at lowest settings, it really starts to struggle, and you will see 1% lows down to 30 FPS, and that isn't really an enjoyable experience. So if we compare it to the other GPUs in 720p, we can see that all of them could play fairly playable. Keep in mind this is still all of the lowest settings, so 720p isn't looking too good, but 86 average on the 5700G isn't that bad, and then you will have 22% more average frame rate with the 1050 Ti, and then a big jump up with the 1650. On the 5700G in 1080p, we go down to 48 frames average, and personally I don't really think this is playable, even though 48 with this feels kind of smooth for being 48 frames average, but it's still nothing I would enjoy playing at, and still with the 1050 Ti it's really marginal playing at 1080p with this one as well. So if you want to play at 1080p in Modern Warfare Multiplayer, which isn't that demanding of a game, I would recommend at least a 1650 that we can see makes a big jump from the other ones. Moving on to Warzone Resurgence, I wouldn't really say it's playable on either 1080p or 720p. I managed to get a few kills, but the gameplay it's just so laggy and low FPS drops and such, so almost like puked while playing, so not a good experience at all. So overall we get lower frame rates in Resurgence compared to regular multiplayer because it's a bigger map and more things to render and such. And we can see here, I would say that with the 5700G I wouldn't really call it playable in either 720 or 1080p. And for the 1050 Ti we get a little bit better performance, but I would say that it's playable in 720p, but if you move anything over that it just doesn't really feel right. And we can still see that the 1650 here is in a totally different league, and it's fully playable even at 1080p, and we can even turn up the settings a little bit and still have a good experience. So moving on to Vanguard, even on this fairly small shipment map here, we can see that the FPS numbers in 1080p isn't up to the task for an enjoyable experience, and if we turn down the render resolution to like 66%, which is around like 720p, I even think that looks better compared to 1080p native, all of the low settings. Because I think the game then turns up the anti-aliasing and such. But then we get a playable frame rate even with the 5700G in 720p. Comparing the FPS numbers, we can see that we get marginally better performance with a 1050 Ti, but those frames really help, and with the render resolution set to 66%, with the 5700G is just barely playable, but I think at least with the 1050 Ti it's playable at least, and 1650 is still in a totally different league. And 1080p rendering at full resolution, I would say it's only playable with the 1650. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, playing here in 1080p with the preset set to low. This is not even the lowest preset you can get, but I feel it's fully playable and it's looking good, and a car game differs to like a first-person shooter online game. 53 frames for me feels still smooth because we don't have that sharp turns and such. And comparing the FPS numbers, we can still see that we get much better performance with a dedicated GPU. And here the difference was actually bigger compared to the other games, even though it was fully playable with the 5700G in my opinion. And we also need to keep in mind here with the 1650, I would guess the average would be somewhere around 140 to 150 if it wasn't for the built-in like limiter in this game, because we can't set the FPS to unlimited. And I didn't really hook up a faster screen than 144 Hz, so we were capped to that frame rate. So at some times the GPU was just running at like 95%, so we were losing out some frames. So in conclusion, I was hoping more from the 5700G, and I was expecting it to perform like this 1050 Ti, and personally I don't really think this 1050 Ti is up to playing modern games, especially not at 1080p, which for me is like the lower threshold. I don't really want to play a game at 720p because then we are really impacting on the visual experience. But if you play some lower demanding games and games that are not like competitive with too fast movements, this can still do good in some use cases. But personally, for playing with this computer here at 1080p, I would at least want something like the 1650, and this is still mostly for running 1080p at low settings. But it was interesting testing the performance of the built-in APU on the 5700G, but for this to be a good rig, I will think I will have to maybe put in a 3060 or so.